Morning, folks, and well, it's Friday again. Uh, in the wall days, it's April Fool's Day. April 1. Aren't we lucky? We're right at home today. So this morning, we're going to be taking more testimony on H2626, and we have, I believe, Heather Darby with us, and Andrew, is that Marquez?
Munkris.
Yeah. Good morning, morning. And Heather, are you on?
Yep, right here.
Yeah. There you are. Now we can see
Yep.
you. Good morning. Good
Morning.
to see you. Yesterday we had kind of a lengthy discussion regards to this bill and the neonicotinoids, and knowing, Heather, that you work a lot with farmers and with different pests and all that, wanting to get your take on the bill, and then we'll move over and hear from Andrew. So if you want to take over from
Sure.
here, be glad to listen. And if we have questions, we'll interrupt and try to be
Okay.
disruptive and ask you the questions. So
Yeah, great.
well, thanks
All
for
right.
being with us. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and appreciate always the opportunity to visit. So yeah, I mean, I think we all know that the use of neonics has gained a lot of attention, not just here in Vermont, but across the globe. And there are obvious reasons for any pesticide really to be challenged, because the goal of a pesticide is to kill pests. And I guess it's not funny, but really that's what we're doing. And the use of pesticides, we know, can have intended effects, and then sometimes it can also have unintended consequences. And clearly those we try to avoid. And when I say we, all the people that are at play here, between the farmers that are using them or the professionals that are trained to use them on the farmers' behalf, to the EPA trying to register products that will have the least impact, etc. But we do know clearly that we have to deal with the pests that impact crop production. And there's tons of information out there about, even with us dealing with pests in different ways, they have a serious impact on production, food production, and other production that leads to food production. So pests are an issue, and to think that they're not in agriculture, then most people probably haven't farmed. They're a problem in livestock, they're a problem in crops, etc. So, and it's challenging to deal with them, and we know some of the effects that they've caused, and again, we're hearing more and more about that as time goes on, and our ability to measure the effects becomes greater. Have we improved? Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure any of you can remember maybe your parents. I can remember mine. My dad mixing up chemicals by himself with his arm or a stick, no protection, none of those things. And then going out and, applying those. A lot of pesticides have been banned. that we've used in the past because of obvious reasons. And so, we're always revisiting these issues. And again, this one is one that has caused a lot of revisiting. So in Vermont, the real question here in this bill is focused on corn seed and the neonics that are applied to the corn seed. And most seed, probably 98%, I imagine, that's an estimate. And so for me, is treated. And you've probably heard in all the testimony that you have received that, in the commercial, conventional seed corn world, all the seed comes treated with the neonics. Now, it didn't used to be that way. And actually, even within my time at UVM, that wasn't always the case. So that sort of regular treatment probably started about 15 years ago. Okay, so I've been here now for 19 years, and there were years where it was optional to have your seed corn treated. You didn't have to receive the seed that way. And you were able to decide if you wanted it treated with a higher rate of neonic or a lower rate or not at all. And that choice has gone away, right? So now, and I'm sure you've heard this. To me, that's an issue when you don't necessarily have the choice to decide. I think we all see that as a problem in anything we do in life. And so that is an issue. So farmers can buy untreated seed corn, completely untreated with nothing on it. And I'm sure you've also heard that not that easy to obtain. And it takes a lot of planning if you want to get completely untreated corn seed. And planning means, really it has to be ordered in August, sometimes September of the prior year, really before farms have even harvested the current year's corn. So that's a real, not only a challenge, but clearly from a management perspective on the farm, just being able to plan out what you're going to need, what variety, what maturity, all those kinds of things generally, ideally wouldn't happen until December, January. But at that point, largely, it's just really too late to get untreated seed. Now, I will also add that, what you may be able to get untreated is certainly not the full gamut of what's available. And, variety selection and picking the right variety for your conditions is probably one of the number one, management decisions that farmers need to make sure that they're getting what they need out of the crop. And, most people don't realize how different varieties can really be, not just in yield, but in our farmers' case, in quality, which is very important for feeding livestock. We want to have quality that essentially minimizes the need for farmers to then go out and buy, corn or grain from somewhere else. So, their choice goes way, way down. And, I'll add that the choices that we have for growing corn in Vermont are certainly not as large, not nearly as large as other places. And some of that really has to do with our short season. So we're already fairly limited in what we have available, and this further would limit that for sure. So I do know farmers now, I don't know any in Vermont, but I know farmers now in various parts of the United States that have started treating their own corn seed, buying corn seed that's untreated, and then setting up a whole nother, operation on their farm to do their own seed treatments. And, those are farms that are, trying to steer away from always having to use various products, right? So they're trying to basically be able to take some control over what is on their seed corn. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bringing it to the farm and treating it with neonics. They may be treating it with fungicide, which is also very common on the corn seeds. So, but that, that certainly is not realistic for most of our farms here in Vermont. I don't really see people doing that, especially on the scale that most people are, and really you have to have a license to do that. And it's, we kind of almost probably be going back to the times where, people were maybe not as safely doing this as they could. All right, so what is it that we're actually trying to control? And I get this asked this question a lot, like, well, do we even need this stuff? And I do feel like there's some perception out there that we don't need these neonics or these insecticides. Let's just leave it at that. And in Vermont, because of the cool, wet nature of our soils in the spring, there's a lot of risk when you put those seeds in the ground. And the cool, wet soils are, a harbor for all kinds of fungus, water molds, and insect pests, all looking for food. They're just looking for a snack. And here's this wonderful, juicy, big old snack sitting there for them first thing in the spring. So these insect pests are an issue, or have been an issue, right? So the primary pest that we are trying to control with the neonics is seed corn maggot. And it is called seed corn maggot, but it also does impact other crops as well, not just corn. And, it's a maggot. So there are flies, sometimes you see those, well, you may not see them if you're not in the field, but you see those early season flies all around. Sometimes you wonder why that's the only insect out, but that's when the seed corn maggot fly is out. They're out in the spring, in April and May, and they're laying eggs. And those eggs, right, hatch into maggots. And so when you have corn seed in the ground in the early spring, so again, in May, those maggots hatch and they attack organic matter and corn, or any kind of seed that's out there at that time. Corn, besides forages and small grains, corn, is by far probably one of the earliest crops that we plant in Vermont. We don't really think about it maybe that way. And it is generally going into soil that is still relatively cold and often wet. And so it doesn't emerge as quickly, right, as the crops that we put in the ground at the end of May or into June. So they end up sitting in the ground sometimes for 2 weeks before they'll even emerge. And those protectants are what allow them to survive and then ultimately be able to emerge and produce a full crop. So seed corn maggot is an early, it's an early spring pest. The other thing about seed corn maggot is that it's not going, its target host is not the corn. Its target or its food source is organic matter. So one of the other reasons we have trouble with seed corn maggot in our state is because we actually have really high organic matter soils. And we also are applying organic matter often in the form of manure. So that is an attractant of the fly, of the maggot, right? So high organic matter fields with, just basically attracts the fly, and, they lay their eggs again and we get maggots. And if there's corn in that field, that, they start eating on it as well. So we do know that the seed corn maggot causes lots of issues. It's very prevalent in our area. And it is true, I probably haven't seen much devastating results from maggot, but almost all of our fields of corn have been treated, right? So I wouldn't expect to be seeing those losses, and probably haven't seen many losses at all. There still are some, in the last 15 years. So, it's hard to say at this point that taking them away would be good, because prior to all of that treatment, there was, substantial losses, and people did use insecticides in the planter boxes. So when they were planting, it was put into the insecticide box. Planters don't come with insecticide boxes anymore because the seed itself is treated. So, but you can still order them for sure. So high organic matter fields, which again is something we're super proud of in Vermont, and we've continued to make a huge amount of progress on increasing the organic matter levels and the different types of management that we use to do that. Certainly is it's a welcoming feast for certain pests, like the seed corn maggot. And, there is some evidence out there that, cover crops, manure, tillage, tilled fields, they increase, the chance of getting seed corn maggot. So like I said, it's hard to say. And it's also really hard to do experiments right now that would compare no insecticide to insecticide because of the long-term usage of the treated seed corn. We'd have to find places that haven't been treated, but also aren't necessarily close to fields that have been treated. The pests are being suppressed and, reducing the rate of these pests because, the seed is treated yearly. What are other options for farmers? Are there scouting options? Should we be scouting? So there's already the challenge that I mentioned, and I'm sure other people have mentioned this too, that, you can scout, but scouting for this pest is not really, it's like too late, right? So there's no rescue treatment for seed corn maggot. If you go out in the spring and you see a bunch of flies, you probably already have the corn seed in the ground. There's no rescue treatment. There's no treatment really once it's in the ground. I did see some scouting, I think in the bill, fall scouting maybe or something. And that's been promoted, but fall scouting with the bait cups and such, that's not for seed corn maggot. That's for wireworm. And wireworm can be an issue for sure in Vermont, but it's definitely a very different issue than seed corn maggot. So that fall scouting is not for this pest, and this is the primary pest that we're concerned about. So I'm not that would be a waste of time by any means, but it is very time intensive and, something that would take a lot of people a lot of time to do, especially if we're going to scout every field. It's pretty time consuming. So wireworm also is a later pest, right? So it generally affects, it doesn't affect corn as much that's planted earlier. So if the corn can get in the ground and come up, within 5 to 7 days and is growing rapidly, then the seed corn maggot is definitely far less of a concern, right? There can certainly still be outbreaks, but warm soil, good soil health, even though I just said, high organic matter can be an issue here. Good soil health, warm soils, plenty of moisture, not too much, perfect conditions, get the seed out of the ground 5 to 7 days, then, the seed corn maggot likely, would not really be after the corn at that point, wouldn't be as much of an issue. So we can't, just using that as a way to work around this, I guess, is not necessarily not a very good option, or maybe a realistic one. Some years, right? Some years the ground is really warm in May, and with the climate changing, that may just, become the case all the time. But that's June, basically, right? When the grounds should be getting near 60 degrees and the corn would pop out of the ground in days, really. But when you have 500 acres to plant and you also have first cut to do at that same time, corn takes a priority earlier. So, it is a, issue as far as seed corn maggot goes from that perspective. So, there are models, growing degree day models. You can put traps out again and look for these flies. You can predict when they're going to hatch, right? And these kinds of things. But in December and January, and if that corn is treated, or even if it's not, it's like, what do you do? If it's a warm season and you think, well, I don't really need this, you already have it. You can't just turn your seed back in. That's not how it works. So it makes it really difficult to use adaptive management, right? Which is, potentially could be an option here, but I just don't know how that would really feasibly work at this point. So we have some real challenges here. So what are the yield losses? Again, it's really dependent on how bad the infestation is. Can be 10%, 25, 50, it's hard to say. So, we clearly have losses from other things too out in the fields, but again, with the seed corn maggot, it's those stand losses early in the season. All right. Trying to think of other controls. So, there are other pesticides that could be used. Most of them aren't I would say they're not as effective in controlling seed corn maggot, but there are other potential options, and those would go in the planter box, like the old days. And so, people, I'm sure, would go back to using those. But again, most of them are not as effective. And then the quantities, of course, that you're using are much, much, much greater than what's on a seed. So,
Heather,
yeah.
yesterday, we had testimony on this same bill yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And somewheres during the discussion, it came up that of the neonics that are on corn only utilizes 5% of the treated neonics and the other 95% stays in the soil, and that eventually we're going to ruin our soils because they're going to be full of neonics that aren't really utilized to protect the corn. That they just sit there and stay in the soils. Have you done any tests on the seed itself to see if they're overprescribed with neonics, or if that does damage, neonics damages the soil?
Yeah, so we ourselves have not looked at the rates. I mean, all pesticides are targeting pests. So the corn itself, some, the neonics are systemic, so they're taken up by the corn, but they're also, when the pests go to attack the corn, they eat them and they die. Or, like in the case of an herbicide, you spray the herbicide and, it hits the plant and the plant takes it up, and the plant dies. So the target is not generally the crop itself. So, is the neonic all, sort of eaten by a pest, or, what amount of it may go up systemic into the plant? Yeah, probably not. And that would be really the same for most pesticides. We try to, certainly people that are spraying them and applying them are working hard to make sure they hit the target. But, as far as the rate that's on the corn seed and could it be lower, that I don't know. They did used to in the past, the companies treated at different levels. And I'm not sure if it's the same level now, or, if it could be lower. So that I'm not entirely certain. Maybe that is an option, but I'd have to look into that more. But yeah, I mean, the pesticides are, taken up by generally the target organism and sometimes systemic into the plants. But, with every pesticide, there will be leftovers. We hear that a lot. And neonics and other pesticides, are making their way into the environment, and they have. This is not a new story. And how to minimize that is really the question. And so potentially it could be the rates, Senator. I'd have to look into that more. I don't know what the rate is on the seed that people are receiving. But yes, I mean, it is, you can find papers, where neonics are getting into, maybe coming out of tile, or, getting into water, as well as other pesticides as well. And not to downplay that at all, but also our ability to measure them has become much better, which is good, and at levels that are really, really small as well. And again, that's not to downplay the fact that, these pesticides are in our environment. That's not a new story, and we're constantly challenged with how to continue to figure out how to minimize that. And that it is a challenge. We all know that. There's risks with pesticides. Nobody said that there wasn't risks. Yeah, so that's not an answer, but it is a reality.
Yeah, I'd say you went around the barn a couple of times on that one. Well,
Yep.
But it's very understandable. I mean, anytime you use anything to kill something, there's going to be a risk involved.
There is, and it's at what. So can we do a better job? And believe me, this is. I've written several grants and tried to institute projects to look at all of these pieces. And there's just, especially with this one, there's the challenges that I've mentioned there. And it is true, there's evidence that neonics, they're a pesticide. They're a broad spectrum pesticide. So yes, they do kill biology in the soil. Like, why wouldn't they do that? They're there to kill pests, and they're not that specific. So certainly if other organisms come in contact with them, they have the risk of being killed too. And there is evidence around that, and farmers are trying to figure out how to manage all of this, but the options are difficult here. Yeah.
So Chris has a question.
Yeah, just taking up that point, you know, you're a trusted voice around soil health. And part of what I think what the chair's question makes me think of is the cumulative impact. So we're leaving them behind, or some of the chemical, obviously, maybe a majority is left behind in the soil, and then next year, and then next year, and then next year, and do we have any way of understanding that impact? I mean, somebody must be looking into that, right?
Yeah, people are looking at this. Of course, we haven't done as much of this measurement here in Vermont, in the soils. And like I said, we have been using these pesticides for continuously, really, for about 15 years. Now, crops are rotated, you know, so some fields are probably always getting neonics, some fields aren't. And yeah, but the accumulation in soil has not been measured here.
What about?
I did a study with Sam Alger, who probably, I'm sure, testified to you, Samantha Alger, a few years ago, where we were looking at growing a pollinator crop in a field where corn had been grown. And then we actually also planted corn in that same field to try to increase the potential, you know, for uptake by milkweed. And I don't believe we saw, I don't believe we saw any conclusive evidence there. And she probably testified, and if she didn't mention it, then I don't believe we did. So not to say we shouldn't be doing more work around that. I would agree. Especially if there's enough there that we can take a year off every other year or something, right? I mean, we just don't know that. We do get a good amount of rainfall, right? We get a good amount of rainfall in Vermont, so we do see the movement of nutrients and other compounds down through the soil profile. And there's a lot of, you know, biological activity that would degrade whether, you know, any pesticide in the soil. So, you know, to think that they don't go anywhere, which we know is not true, and that they're just sitting there in the same spot every year, you know, is also not likely. There's a lot of activity in the soils as well as rainfall that would drive them down deeper into the profile and certainly put them in contact with biology, different biology.
I had a different question, if I could, Heather. So we had testimony yesterday from Jacob Bordeaux, who pointed out that the cost for treated and untreated was pretty much the same. At least he had found that to be true, since, as you point out, over 90% of the seed that's sold in Vermont is treated. And so he had a 10% drop in yield when he didn't have a treated seed available. Have you done any sort of experiment where you have two fields, one of them untreated, one of them treated, and was there a difference in the yield?
So I think I mentioned early on, it's again difficult to do those kinds of studies into fields that have been treated for many years, right? So I have used untreated seed often. You know, we have experiments that require us not to have seed treatment for various reasons, but it's not in the same experiment as seed that is treated. So I don't have a direct comparison, but I think it, you know, it's hard. It would be hard to do those studies the way that maybe that one was done, not to downplay that he saw a yield decline, but you know, you really need replicated studies in fields that haven't had long-term treatment of neonics, et cetera, to verify what the yield losses would be. But there's plenty of data prior to seed treatment that shows losses from seed corn maggot. You know, that's why I said it's not, the pest isn't gone. You know, it's still here, and it did a lot of damage prior, you know, to this sort of seed treatment error. So it you know.
Last year, Heather, we set up the Ag Innovation Board to kind of look at things like this. You don't happen to be a member of that, are you? Or do you know?
No, I'm not a member.
Because, you know, what we found, or what have been finding every year, we end up with a bill or two dealing with neonics. And so we set that board up thinking that this would be a group of people like yourself that deal with agronomy and soil health and all of this, and that it would be like a sounding board to come back to us if you found things that, if this board found things that were needed correcting, that you would come and recommend changes to the law. Do you think something like that could work and would work, or were we just dreaming, hoping that it might work?
It seems like a really great idea. And it definitely seems worth the effort. And it could work. You know, it's hard, especially in this case. You know, I know we're going to hear from a beekeeper. I'm also a beekeeper, by the way. So I don't take any of this lightly either. You know, I have 12 to 15 hives that I manage myself on my farm. And I care a lot about my bees. They are, you know, they are my livestock. So just to put that out there, you know, I'm a beekeeper, I'm a farmer, I work with farmers, and I think we all want to come to viable solutions for everybody. And if we could do that together, that's always the best, but you know, that doesn't always work either, as you know. But having the conversations together and hearing from all of, you know, all the various sides is, you know, obviously the best way to work through these kinds of challenges. So I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you do corn on your farm? And if you do, when you put the seeds in the hopper in your planter, if you do grow corn and do that, do you see a lot of dust coming off the out of the hopper that would go into the air, and possibly bees would fly through and it might kill them?
Yeah, so I was just about to say that there are best management practices that are crucial and also effective at managing the dust. And, you know, to the best of my knowledge, that is the primary issue that has been associated with bee death from the neonics is early in the spring, you know, when farmers are planting with certain types of planters, there's more dust, like air seeders as an example. There's a lot of dust that is created. And so once that dust gets, you know, up into the airstream, it can go all over the place. And that in the spring, if it, you know, starts coming down and hitting dandelions, which are one of the primary early spring food sources for the bees, that's when, you know, we're definitely getting into trouble. You know, the bees aren't out in the field digging up the corn. But when the neonics are getting into the airstream, that becomes a problem in the early spring, because of course, you know, if those feed sources get neonics on them, then that would be problematic for the bees for sure. So there are best practices to eliminate that dust. I mean, those are really well known and people should be using those. And probably a requirement and something that's not hard to do, very simple. So most of the planters in Vermont, I would guess, are not air seeders. I know there was a study done in New York, and only, I believe, 30% of those planters were air seeders. So in Vermont, that number is going to be a lot less. And you know, that again, it's a simple practice. There's products basically that keep that dust from moving.
So if a farmer uses best practices, they usually don't hire a custom planter that uses an air
Some of
seeder,
them,
or-
yeah. Some people use custom planters. Some of the farms have air planters, but a lot of them don't. But I mean, that's a really simple thing.
And Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Heather, how are your hives? How are the bees doing? And, you know, are they healthy? Are you seeing a decline like we heard yesterday?
Yeah. So I definitely haven't been a beekeeper as long as many folks in Vermont, but I've been a beekeeper for about 15, 16 years. And I've always found it challenging to keep the hives, or to get the hives overwintered. And I would say generally, you know, a lot of the times during the season, they are doing very well. And I have some losses, but it's really the winter where I've found it increasingly really difficult to get them through the winter. And, you know, I believe it's a whole number of factors. You know, for us, these sort of weather extremes, and, you know, I'm sure there's probably environmental issues as well. We don't have corn on our farm per se, but we are surrounded by cornfields. You know, I don't think you would necessarily see the dust floating in the air. I've never seen anything like that. And I guess I've never seen major bee loss at that time either. Usually, again, for me, it's been primarily in the winter months.
Is that because the temperature in the winter seems like it's fluctuating more now than it did years back? And so you get some warm days and then cold days.
Yeah.
Do you think
Yeah,
that may have something to do with it?
Yeah, that definitely has something to do with it, Bobby. I don't think it's, you know, the only thing, for sure. every case is a little bit different, I find. But yeah, I personally, I haven't tested my bees to see if they've died from something specific. Sometimes, sometimes you have a mite infestation that you're trying to get under control, or, sometimes I'll see signs of a various disease, or, it might be a food shortage or something, but, the weather for me does seem to have a lot to do with it, as well as other, various other factors.
Chris?
What this bill contemplates is having the agency come up with best management proposal for neonics. It's not a ban. It's just sort of digging into some of the questions I think we've been talking about. And we will, of course, be hearing from all folks that want to talk and all sides of the issue. And I would assume if this were law, the agency would, and the board would do that as they come up with a process, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just looking, the half-life in soil of neonics, according to a quick web search, is 2 to 6 years. So potentially best management practices, I should think, could say, every other year or every third year, it's prudent to use treated seeds. Am I totally off base here? I mean, is that the kind of thing that could emerge, and does that have a place in our ag economy?
I can't say with certainty if, every other year use of neonics or something to that effect would make sense. Unfortunately, a lot of what we find on the internet or even in the literature sometimes, because this is such a hot topic, it really needs to be dug into. And I think we also need to, one of my suggestions, because a lot of this research comes out of the Midwest as well. And I know everybody says this, it's not the same here, but that actually is really true because we have these, colder weather, and we have higher organic matter soils. We're trying to encourage farms to do even better in that area. And honestly, we don't necessarily know if these healthy soils that are biologically active actually could suppress maggots more naturally, so I think we need to get really on the ground doing the work here to better understand what's going to work best for our farmers in Vermont. And I, we know pesticides can be persistent, but that doesn't mean they're in the original form that makes them, not good for pests at that point. So.
Nice.
Other questions for Heather?
No.
I guess we're good on this subject. Yesterday or the day before, we checked with John Roberts to see how many farmers actually signed up for the milk loss payment program, and it's still hanging right around 75%. We was hoping that with taking care of that premium payment, that we talked about last summer at our task force meetings, we would get that number up higher. Do you know how any of your farmers up your way, did they get signed up good?
Yeah, so we got the word out. The sign up got pushed further out. I know that was a concern for a lot of people. I think before this came out, people were really on the fence about if they were going to sign up because the milk prices were going up, and so they were, not as interested. So that might be some of it, unfortunately. And then getting the word out, making sure people know to go and sign up, which we've done our best, but we don't reach everybody either. So if, I think it's too late now, but
Yeah, it
you know,
ended last.
if I think if we do it, if this happens again, you know, more people will know. I think that was a challenge, is just that short turnaround to get the word out, hit every farmer we could, educate and get them signed up. So we'll have more time to do that. So it,
I mean, we have money left.
yeah,
over.
well, right, exactly. So it's, I don't want to say it wasn't appreciated, that's for sure, but
Well,
those are the
because-
challenges.
what I hear back home, we haven't had witnesses in yet, but what I've heard up north over New Orleans and Essex County is the cost of fertilizer, grain products, all types of grain products, fuel oil, all those things have driven and are driving the cost up. So the difference between what the farmer's getting paid and their cost of producing the milk, the costs are keeping up, if not going ahead of the increased milk price. So, you know, if that's happening across the country, that MIC will be kicking in again this year somewheres, once they get those costs and the cost of production and the milk price figured out. So I don't know, maybe it'll help, and there's pretty good insurance to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think some of our concern that we talked about a lot, you know, during that meeting, and that we heard from people that testified, was that so many folks are not, I don't want to say educated on the topic, but just, you know, they don't know what to do, or even like, you know, this whole thing around insurance, and just again, the education and outreach that's needed. And when such a valuable program like you said, it comes across at no cost, that we couldn't get 100% signed up. But
Yeah,
not shocking either, I guess. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Well, you know, anytime you spend a couple of $1 million and get 20 back, that's what happened last year.
Yeah.
It's kind of, you know, I'd sit all day and trade money with anybody at those rates.
yeah. Yeah.
Any-
I know you have another speaker, and I just want to say that I am there to help the farmers with education on this topic for sure. And it is high on our priority list within my team. I had mentioned that we applied for, you know, we're 100% grant funded, unfortunately. So, you know, our focus is around what we get funded to do. And we have applied and hopefully receive from the EPA some funding that is meant to go specifically towards education on best management practices with treated seed, but also, you know, scouting and management and trials that we talked about. We are sampling neonics in one of the projects that I have in a heavy corn growing area. And, you know, we don't have the data back yet, but when we do, you know, that will help inform us further. So we need the information. As you know, I've always tried to come here with the research that we have from Vermont, because that's what we need to make the best decisions. And around this topic too, it's not any different. You know, degradation in the soil, all those things are driven by the weather and conditions here, not those in Indiana or Tennessee or wherever, you know, a lot of that work has been done. So I don't want you to think that we're not trying to work on it. And I know that it's urgent. as well. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that for what it's
Well,
worth.
We, we value the extension service and the work that you folks do very highly. And certainly that's why we, wanted to get you in to discuss this issue. And we do have, we all serve on different committees in the afternoon on the Senate side. And and maybe you already know this, but if not, we do have an extra $10 million in the big bill to help UVM on their base budget stuff. So hopefully extension and the ag school will pick up a little money there as well. So
Yeah, we
no, it's always,
definitely need people to do the work. So people are expensive. It's challenging.
Yeah. well, it's
But
next to impossible to hire anybody.
yeah, we're also 5 people short on my team. So
5 people. Yeah,
we're
that's
we're feeling it too. And but I'm happy to share the grant that I did write to the EPA, and I believe we have almost received it, and share that with the stakeholders as well. Happy to share that with the Beekeepers Association and the pollinator folks, and really work together on this. I don't think it's challenging, but not impossible for us to do a better job. So.
Yeah, well, you can't ask for much more than working together and trying to come up with new and better outcomes. So,
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you had for us, Heather?
No, I just good to see you all, and excited to get the field season going. Hopefully it'll be a good one.
Yeah. Well, very good. Thanks again for your time. We appreciate that and your knowledge, and have a lot of faith in you. So keep up the good work. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So now Andrew. Good morning.
Andrew.
Did you have something you wanted to say to me, Heather?
I don't know.
I just wanted to say hi. And it also wasn't when I said that I would love to work more closely with the beekeepers and pollinator folks. I didn't want you to think I was just saying that. So we should connect as well. Like that wasn't
That's great. Thank
that
you
was
for that. And
a solid offer.
great, let's be in touch.
Yeah, you're welcome to stay on if you want, Heather. Good morning, Andrew, and welcome. Good to see you, and we'll give the floor over to you.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everybody still has some room in their heads after all the information that Heather shared.
Well, you should have been with us yesterday. It was running out of my ears.
I can believe that. So my position is as the president of the Vermont Beekeepers Association. And in that role, obviously, is why I'm here today. I took some notes while Heather was speaking, and I'll try and give you some background on why this is so important to the beekeepers. And after hearing Heather talk, I'm not quite sure where to start, but I think I'll start where I was planning to, and I'll come back and address some of the things that Heather talked to you about a little bit later. So we touched on briefly the various routes of exposure to neonicotinoids that honeybees encounter in their life. And I'll just start there. bees, as you're aware, forage broadly over a large area, and their behavior is that they eat pollen as a source of protein, and they eat nectar from plants as a source of carbohydrates, and they collect water from the environment, both for the purpose of diluting honey and for mixing food for the larval bees, and also they gather water to cool the hives in the springtime. So the queen bee lays an egg in the hive, and after 3 days, that egg hatches into a larva, and it's in its larval form for 5 or 6 days. And during this stage is when it needs most of its protein. And so the pollen is gathered during the growing season, and the pollen is mixed with nectar and honey and is fed to the larva. Any larva that is poisoned during this stage of its life will have a shortened life expectancy. And studies have shown that their brains also don't develop properly such that they aren't able to navigate. So exposure during the larval stage to neonicotinoids will cause those adult bees, when they're fully developed, to never be completely ripe. Another route of exposure, as Heather mentioned, is through air planters. This is much more common in the Midwest, but in terms of legislation, it's clearly a low-hanging fruit. The simple solution, an air planter is simply a planter that, instead of using mechanical metal plates to drop seeds down tubes, it uses compressed air. And after the compressed air has blown the seeds down the tubes to get planted, the compressed air is vented out the back of the planter. And obviously not all the seed treatment powder stays on the seeds. And so some of it gets mixed in the air and it gets exhausted out of the back of the planter. And there are many, many studies from around the country that any pollinators flying through those clouds of dust, which may not be visible to you or me, will cause an acute die-off. In general, that's the only way that you will see a pollinator die off from neonics. So the advantage of neonics is they don't have to be sprayed. You don't see die-offs like you do when you spray malathion or some of the other insecticides. And let's just be clear, we call these pesticides because we like to use them to kill pests, but they are truly insecticides. They are non-selective and they kill any insect that they encounter. And as an insect farmer, that's obviously concerning to me. And interrupt me at any time if you have a question. So the only difference.
I was just reminded that in legislation, I think we call them economic poisons or something, some strange term of art like that. But to your point, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but.
No, not at all. Not at all. Please jump in. It's a lot more fun if we have a discussion than if you guys just listen to me. So yeah, exactly. We're using these poisons because there's an economic benefit. And what I'm here to address is the unintended consequences. These are obviously beneficial to the dairy farmers. And when we think of agriculture in Vermont, we tend to think of dairy. That's been, for probably 80 or 100 years, that's been the mainstay of Vermont agriculture. It wasn't always. I'm from Cornwall, where the merino sheep industry was once king of Vermont agriculture. And I think we're seeing, again, an evolution in Vermont agriculture as dairy prices stay suppressed. So let's not just take it as a given that we have to be growing all this corn and we have to be treating it with poisons, because honeybees are actually fundamental to Vermont agriculture as well. And any vegetable farmer in the state, any orchardist in the state is 100% dependent on the honey beekeepers for pollination. We've done an amazing job of killing off the native pollinators. So they're at levels that are about 50% or lower of what they used to be. And what this means is that as home gardeners, as vegetable growers, as orchardists, we're even more dependent on managed honeybee colonies than we used to be. So my goal out of this would be to try not to kill the bees if we can help it. And I'll try and explain how it's happening, why it's so confusing, and what it's doing to the state's beekeepers. So we talked about
Andrew, how many pounds of honey do we produce in a year in Vermont? Or is it measured by pounds or gallons?
It is measured by pounds, and I don't have that information at my fingertips. I knew it a couple months ago when the report came out for last year, but it's many hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Yeah.
And there's,
It's delicious.
yep. And of course, the honey is just one product. The pollination, the value of the pollination is probably exceeds the value of all the honey produced.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. And I can get you that information. I'll be referencing some studies while talking, but rather than bore you by putting up a PowerPoint and making you read through it now, I'm going to email to Linda the letter with all the information and links to the studies, and you guys can read those afterwards. And I would encourage you to read some of the studies because there's a lot of research that has been done. And it gets a little confusing because the pesticide companies do their own research as well. And personally, I would trust Penn State over the research done by the manufacturers of the pesticides.
I don't know why you do that.
Call me a cynic. So we talked about the larval stage of the honeybees and how just like a human baby, they're really susceptible to chemical exposure at that stage. So if the bees are foraging on anything which is contaminated with a pesticide and they bring that back to the hive, the larvae are really the vulnerable ones. The adult bees won't get killed by this except by attrition, chronic exposure over a long period of time, or by an acute exposure like the planter dust we were talking about. I think it would definitely be worth mandating by law that any air planters be fitted with filters to keep the neonic dust out of the air. That's really not the huge issue in Vermont. That's a much bigger issue in the Midwest. The bigger issue in Vermont is that the bees are being exposed at an especially vulnerable time. During the course of their life, honeybees usually live for about 5 weeks. The winter bees, on the other hand, have to survive the entire winter. So they have to live over 5 months because it's too cold starting in about October for the bees to raise any replacement bees. So the way that a colony or a hive of honeybees stays alive is by constantly replacing the worker bees. The queen is always laying eggs. There are always new bees emerging, maturing, and replacing the bees that are dying. And during the growing season, the bees are literally working themselves to death, and it only takes about 5 weeks. During the winter, they stay dormant. They go into the hive. They huddle together and keep warm. And those bees have to live from October until April, when there's pollen available again and nectar from the soft maples for them to start growing and expanding. And they once again start to produce more bees to replenish the colony. So those bees that are the winter bees are raised during August. And unfortunately, that's also the time that the corn is tasseling. And depending on the season and how wet it's been, how dry it's been, whether the wildflowers are still blooming, whether they're not blooming, the bees will usually bring in a certain amount of corn pollen. And as Heather discussed, the issue with the neonics is that they're a systemic pesticide. So if they were simply a seed treatment, like the fungicides that used to be used to keep the seed corn from rotting in the cool soil in the spring, that would not be an issue because they would stay in the soil. But they are in every cell of that corn plant. They're in the leaf tissue, the stem tissue, and they're in the pollen. So when the bees gather the pollen and bring it back to the hive, they're feeding that neonicotinoid infused pollen to the larva. When the bees gather water that catches where the leaf attaches to the stem of the plant, they've done studies in Europe where that water that is dew that has run down the leaves and caught in the leaves of the plants, that water has levels of neonics that are detectable. And the bees gather that water in a dry summer and they bring that back to the hive and they feed that to the larva. The other problem is that as you guys were bringing up, the neonics stay in the soil and it does not actually break down that fast. And it gets taken up by whatever you plant in the field the next year. It moves in the surface water and in the groundwater, and it gets taken up by the goldenrod that's growing in the ditches. It gets taken up by the dandelions that are growing in the field the following year. And the bees gather pollen and nectar from those plants and get exposed. It's really hard. It's extremely difficult to show these levels of exposure. The detection threshold for neonics in a sample tested in a lab is roughly equivalent to the LD50. And if you're familiar with pesticide testing, the LD50 is the point where half the bees are already dead. And the levels that cause chronic health issues in the bees are much lower than the detection limit. So I'll send you a link to a study at Penn State where they intentionally exposed colonies to neonicotinoids. They were unable to detect the neonics in the hive using conventional pollen testing. But since they had exposed them, they knew that they had exposed them, and they could observe the health effects of the neonics in the hive. So I would encourage you not to waste a whole lot of time. The House Ag Committee wrote a section into the bill about monitoring pollinator health and testing for pesticides. It's all been done, and it's been done by highly reputable places, like I said, like Penn State and Harvard and Michigan and the UMD Beltsville Bee Lab. And to ask the Vermont Department of Ag to start looking for neonics in pollen and in nectar and in bee colonies is a little bit like searching for life in outer space by going out in your yard with a pair of binoculars. We just don't have the money, the resources, or the tools to be doing this testing, but it's already been done. And Heather might be right that there's a difference in Vermont about the soils here, but the exposure of the bees is not different in Vermont. This isn't something like billboards that we can legislate that honeybee exposure to neonics will stop at the state border. This is happening. Vermont had the dubious distinction last year of having the highest rate of colony loss in the entire country. There are many factors impacting that, and the pesticide companies will tell you about the mites, and they'll tell you about habitat loss due to development. They'll tell you about changing land use patterns. They'll tell you about asynchronous bloom due to climate change. And these are all factors. Real life isn't like the science lab experiments where you can narrow it down to one variable. But please don't let it distract you from the fact that the neonics are killing bees. 1 teaspoon of neonicotinoid pesticide, 1 teaspoon has a high enough toxicity to kill every single honeybee in the state of Vermont at the height of the summer. So with that level of toxicity, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. You're in the middle of a compelling point. I just want to be in the queue. Go ahead.
Okay.
That level of toxicity.
With that level of toxicity, you cannot pretend that the bees are not being exposed to neonics and that it is not affecting their health. Because we aren't spraying these on the fields and putting it in the air all the time, the levels of exposure are very low. But what happens from chronic low-level exposure is that it weakens the bees to the point where they succumb to other pathogens, such as nosema, such as viruses. And so we have seen the honeybee losses increase from 2006 until the present level, which, as I said, the present level is we've got the dubious distinction of having the highest losses in the country. That isn't going to happen every year. It takes a confluence of factors to have the highest rate of losses. It's most likely due to the confluence of neonic exposure, pathogens that are already in the hives, and then bad weather. If we get a drought, then there's less food for the bees, and you add that all together, and what you have is a horrible year. Does that mean we shouldn't do something about the neonics? Of course not. We can't control the weather. We can't control climate change, just as Vermont. That has to be controlled on a worldwide scale. But we can do something about the pesticides. There's a great program in Ontario where they really reduced the use of the neonics by requiring farmers to show that they're going to have a significant economic loss if they don't use them. And the amount of neonics that have been used in Ontario has reduced drastically. And Ontario has significantly lower honeybee losses over winter than we do in Vermont. So the reason, as Heather said, the reason the bees are dying over winter is this chronic low-level exposure, which is weakening the bees as they go through that vulnerable period where the bees have to live longer than at any other time in the season. All right, now I've got a bunch more to say, but I can tell that somebody's got a question here, so I'll pause and let you guys.
Yeah. Thanks,
Go ahead, Chris.
Andrew. Oh boy, I got a lot of questions.
Please.
I have elementary school girls at home, and I sometimes like to try to help them understand my job down here. And it can be confusing to describe it to a third grader. I don't think this one would be confusing actually for them. And I'd say, well, what about the dairy farmer? And I just think emotionally that wouldn't resonate. But they don't have the full range of what we have to consider, obviously. But I just, emotionally, it's clear to me that the case you're making. I guess my question is, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we do have a proposal in front of us that forces the agency through the structure to come up with best management practices. In your opinion, I guess I'm wondering if that's adequate, and why would we hope that would suffice? And then if you wouldn't mind, and maybe it's in your comments anyway, play it out for me. If I have to describe to the Senate why I want to be aggressive about this, and I offer to people that aren't steeped in this, sort of bee farmers versus dairy farmers, that's politically a problem. But so if you could really help me understand, it's not just bee farmers, it's veggie, it's fruit, it's this whole, like, really paint the picture for me of the universe. If you had all the time and resources to have the coalition of impacted people, it's well beyond bee farmers, and I'd like to help. I'd like your help understanding those two questions: the adequacy of this proposal, and really the pool of agricultural impacts, including bee farmers.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue into the next section of my comments here. So thank you for the question. I'll touch on the adequacy of the current legislation, and I'll just say, as an association, the VBA was extremely disappointed with what the House did with this bill. Best management practices are great, but there's been many attempts over the years to eliminate or reduce the use of neonics. And the easy answer is always to say, well, let's do some research. And it's just a way of kicking the can down the road. And the problem is that the bee losses are becoming so extreme that it's not clear that if we do research for 3 or 4 years and then we think about it for a couple more years, it's not clear that some of these commercial beekeepers will still be in business. It's not clear that they can sustain the losses that they're having and keep going. So what was great about the House version of the bill was that it instituted a ban and then mandated required practices for IPM, for testing, for use only if there was a need for the pesticides. If you actually look at the Vermont pesticide regs, the very first section talks about not using any chemical that isn't absolutely needed, using the least toxic chemical possible in any situation. And what we're talking about is tens of thousands of pounds of pesticide that is being used prophylactically because there might be a problem. And Heather painted a fairly compelling picture for the problem with corn maggot, but we don't actually know what the losses would be. There's been many studies throughout the country that have been done already comparing the neonic treated seed with fungicide treated seed, and the difference in yield is usually about 5%. So I can't swear that it would be like that in Vermont, but I'll include the information about those studies. You can read them and see them. So what we're talking about is an inconvenience for the dairy farmers. Their yield is reduced versus a beekeeper who's lost half of their livestock. And when the average of bee losses is 50%, that means somebody's losing a lot more than 50% to get the average up to 50%. And you can bet that if the dairy farmers were losing 50% of their cows every winter, you guys would have already done something about it. Just going to leave that sit there for a second.
But a bee doesn't cost as
Yeah,
much
much
as a
smaller.
cow, right?
So in acute numbers, of course not. It would take several colonies of bees lost to equal a cow.
But we shouldn't be losing either.
I completely agree. So I do not envy you guys because you are in the proverbial rock in a hard place where you're trying to make sure that the dairy farmers who are already in an economically tight spot are not subjected to further economic hardship. In the meantime, I challenge you to try and do something so that the beekeepers aren't completely wiped out. So let me explain kind of what it looks like. And I'll tell you some stories. I'm not going to name the beekeepers, but as president of the association, every spring for many years now, my phone rings off the hook and everybody has to tell me what's happened to their bees. And I hear what's happening to their business. Obviously, the hobby beekeepers are losing hives too, but for them, this is not their livelihood. So I'll tell you about a friend from over in Eastern Vermont who spring of 2021 had lost 80% of his bees. And when you lose a colony of bees, you've got a few choices for replacement. And it's similar to a dairy farm where you could go out and you could buy a new hive, just like buying a new cow, or you could take the slow road and you could try and raise replacement colonies of bees from the colonies that you already have. But you can either make bees or you can make honey. So if you have only 20% of your bees left, it's going to take you 2 or 3 years to get back up to the size you were. And in the meantime, you're not going to be producing any honey crop, which means you have nothing to live on. So this fella had about 1,000 hives and he lost 800 of them. And he couldn't not produce a honey crop. And so he basically cashed out all of his retirement plans and he bought in bees from the south to replace those. And right now, a replacement colony, whether it's a nucleus colony or whether it's a package of bees, costs about $200. So he spent about $160,000 just to get back to where he had been the fall before. And then he had all the same expenses and he doesn't know what sort of survival he'll get this winter. The southern bees don't generally do quite as well as the bees that have been raised here. So that's a risk as well. So, you know, compared to the amount of money that dairy farmers are throwing around, $160,000 might not be much, but for a beekeeper with 1,000 colonies with very tight profit margins, that's huge. That's the difference between being able to retire and not retire.
Yeah.
That's the difference between staying in business and going out of business. And if the beekeepers give up and go out of business, then there's, as I said before, there's no managed honeybee colonies to be pollinating the vegetable farms and the orchards. So this is a huge issue.
Is having that many colonies or hives, I mean, I don't really know a lot about bees. Is that, would that be considered a large beekeeper or medium or small?
So the USDA divides beekeepers into 3 categories. There's hobby beekeepers who have fewer than 50 hives. There's sideline beekeepers who have between 50 and 300 hives. And then there's commercial beekeepers who have more than 300 hives. So in Vermont, a 1,000 hive operation would be considered a pretty good sized operation. And it would
Yeah.
definitely be commercial. You can make a living off of 1,000 hives.
Yeah. Thanks.
And, it'd probably be roughly equivalent to a 500 count dairy, something like that. So some of the operations here have many more than that, multiple thousands of hives, but most of the commercial operations are in the 1,000 to 2,000 hive range. We have at the height of every season, we ourselves have about 1,000 hives, just over. And not all of those are for producing honey. Some of them are for producing queens. Some of them are producing bees for sale. Because there's so much die off, there's a huge market for replacement bees. So if you can produce bees, you can always sell them. But ultimately, it's not sustainable to have this level of colony loss. So the goal really would be to balance it. Beekeepers can sustain some level of colony loss, and we will always have loss because of introduced mites and the pathogens that live in the hives. But the goal would be to try and get it down to a dull roar. The Pollinator Protection Committee that met several years ago recommended outright ban on the neonicotinoids. And that was extremely divisive. Obviously, the farmers were not in favor of it, but some pollinator experts were concerned as well, because everybody's always afraid about the enemy that they don't know. And the next pesticide to come down the road might actually be worse than the neonics. They might have to go back to aerial spraying or to broadcasting pesticides. And so the VBA is supportive of a limited ban where it would be required to follow IPM practices if we could simply drastically reduce the use of neonics instead of relying on them for prophylactic treatment. It might be enough. I'm not going to say it will be enough, but it might be enough. And it seems like a very reasonable balance between economic loss to the dairy farmers and economic loss to the beekeepers.
What's that called, Andrew? What practice is that?
It's called integrated pest management.
Oh,
And
IP.
IPM, yeah. And it basically means you don't use a pesticide unless you know you've got a problem. And Heather described the difficulties in that approach. Again, I would recommend reaching out to Ontario Extension because they're already doing this. They're in a northern climate. They have cold, wet soils and late springs. They're pulling this off and they're doing a pretty good job. The House was going to get somebody in from Ontario to speak to them, but they didn't manage to pull it off. And I think that was a big loss. Obviously, I'd love to see no pesticides used at all. I'd love it if all the farmers in the state went organic, because then they wouldn't be killing our bees. That's not realistic. And since we live in the real world, we just have to try and limit the damage. So in terms of whether this current proposal goes far enough, I think not, because you can put best management practices out there, but similar to it's the best management practice not to spread liquid manure on frozen ground next to a river, unless you actually make it illegal. There are still people who are going to do it. And so Vermont made it illegal to spread manure on frozen ground to certain dates to avoid contaminating the waterways. And I would say that any bill the Senate comes up with would need to actually use the force of law to enforce the requirements for IPM or following BMPs, because voluntary, it's just a hassle to have to do these things, to have to test. And the dairy farmers aren't trying to kill the bees. They're just trying to do their job and make a living. But they're not going to do it just because it's nice.
Yeah.
Any further questions?
Well, I was wondering, if you were listening, when Heather was on, I asked her about last year, we tried to, or we did set up an ag innovation board to handle issues like this and, to come back to us with, the board would be made up with a group of well-rounded individuals that, would sit around the table and hash this stuff out. And I don't know, I heard they had one meeting. They've had one meeting and have another one planned. Do you folks, do you know if any of your folks or your membership was invited to participate in those meetings?
So I'm quite familiar with the AIB. After reading, the House proposal for this bill, we looked up every member. Nobody from the pollinator community, either from the environmental end or from the beekeeper end, was invited to sit on that board. So currently there are no pollinator representatives on that board. So we sent a member of the VBA board and sent a request to the chair of the committee, and we sat in on that committee meeting. Obviously, we can't participate because we're not on the board, but we had a representative there, and we intend to have a representative at all of those meetings when they meet. Aside from the concern about no representation, there's also a concern about the information that's being shared. The representative from the Department of Agriculture made the statement right at the beginning of the meeting that there was no evidence in Vermont showing that honeybees were being affected by neonicotinoid pesticides. So that's the Agency of Agriculture's position. Again, I say to you, there are numerous studies from around the world that show that they are, and that that statement was made based on the test of 2 hives of bees that was done in 2012. And there were 2 pollen samples taken from each hive. And that's why a statement was made. And I will put it before you that 2012 is not an accurate representation of what was going on, and those studies were inadequate to address the current situation. So the VBA is funding the Vermont Bee Lab at UVM to do additional testing. We sent off 20 samples for pesticide testing to Cornell. We'll be doing more collection this summer. We already know, like I said, the detection threshold is high enough to kill half the bees. So if we do get any positive hits, it means we've already got a major exposure problem. Even if we don't get any hits, it does not mean that the bees in Vermont are not being exposed to neonics. There's plenty of studies that show that all bees around are being exposed to neonics. And this is well known in the beekeeping community. In general, in the Champlain Valley, every acre, I won't say every acre, let me explain briefly that in the 80s, the state enacted legislation to space out commercial apiaries. So any bee yard where honeybees are located, if it's managed by a commercial beekeeper, has to be 2 miles away from another commercial beekeeper. And there's several reasons for that legislation. One is to prevent beekeepers from competing with each other. In other words, utilizing the same resources. It also helped prevent overgrazing the commons so that the managed honeybees don't crowd out the native pollinators. And it also slows and limits the spread of disease among honeybee colonies, which is a large concern. The more distance between apiaries, the less likely any transmissible disease is to jump from one apiary to the other. So it's a great law. They're kind of bringing the management of that law up into the 21st century by putting the database online and making it available to all beekeepers. So in the Champlain Valley,
two air miles apart, Andrew? They have to be at least 2 air miles
That's
apart? Yeah.
Yep,
We
two,
don't-
two,
We
two
don't
straight line
have
miles.
that. Yeah. We don't have such a rule in Vermont.
We do. Yep, that is the Vermont law.
Oh, okay.
Yep, what I just described to you. And like I say, that was enacted in the 80s. It was actually enacted in response to the spraying of 7 in Massachusetts due to the gypsy moth caterpillar outbreak. And Massachusetts beekeepers were fleeing the state and dumping their bees in Vermont. And so that apiary law was enacted to protect Vermont beekeepers. And then it has the 3 other benefits that I described about not overgrazing the commons and preventing the spread of disease. So what that means is that most of the locations within the Champlain Valley are already occupied by beekeepers, and the locations are sold or bartered or handed down from beekeeper to beekeeper, and the database is managed by the state. The only exception to that is in areas where there is heavy corn planting. And those bee yards have been abandoned because the beekeepers cannot keep their hives alive. And so when beekeepers are looking for new locations to keep bees, what you do is you go on Google Earth and you look at the satellite photos and you draw a 2-mile circle around where you might like to keep bees, and you see how much corn is in it. And if there's too much corn in it, you don't put bees there because they're going to die. We had a location down in Leicester, Vermont, which was one of our best locations. The bees survived extremely well. We generally had about 80% survival, and it was on an organic vegetable farm, and the vegetable farmer was extremely pleased. His yield of vegetables increased dramatically when we moved bees in there. A neighbor about a half a mile away passed away, and the land was rented out to a large conventional dairy, and they plowed it up and cut down the trees and planted it in conventional corn wall to wall. And our survival rate in that bee yard about a half mile away dropped to between 25 and 35% every winter after that happened. So it's getting increasingly hard to find locations that are both good for honey production and your bees will actually survive.
Andrew,
Yeah. Go ahead.
do bees really like corn, or do they just go to it because it's so dominant?
So it's interesting you bring that up. Honeybees have evolved to have a mechanism by which they can evaluate the quality of nectar. And honeybees will preferentially gather nectar from plants with higher quality nectar. They do not have the ability to measure the quality of pollen. And that's probably because pollen is encapsulated, in a hard shell. And so it has to be broken down through a pickling process in the hives. The bees ferment it in the hive, mix it with a little bit of honey, and the fermentation process breaks down the hard shell of the pollen and then makes it digestible when they feed it to the larva. There's actually a number of studies showing that the use of fungicides in some commercial operations messes up that pickling process in the hive and causes malnutrition in the bees because they can't properly pickle the pollen that they're collecting because it's been treated with fungicides. So that's not part of this legislation, but I just want to put it out there as another example of unintended consequences. When we start messing with things, we cause all kinds of consequences that we're not aware of. So the bees will gather corn pollen because they aren't aware that it's actually a very low quality pollen. But it depends on their proximity to the corn, and it depends on what else is blooming. And in some years, there's absolutely nothing else blooming when the corn is tasseling. And some years, there's amazing amounts of wildflowers still blooming in early August. And so the exposure level to corn pollen specifically will vary dramatically from year to year based on the weather, your exact geographic location, and even how you're managing your hives. We've experimented with putting pollen supplement on the colonies as soon as the corn starts tasseling in an effort to get them to eat the pollen supplement rather than go out and gather corn pollen. And we've had some success at increasing survival by doing that. So we may continue to do that. It's obviously additional labor, it's additional expense. It's not ideal, but it is a possibility. But to me, it simply illustrates how dramatic the exposure is during that time of year. Of course, bees are also foraging on plants that have taken up translocated neonics. And so that pollen might be more attractive to the bees. You know, if goldenrod is growing along the margins of a cornfield, it will have systemic neonicotinoids in it as well. And any pollen that the bees gather from that exposed goldenrod will also contain neonics, and the larva will get exposed through that route. So it's not just the corn pollen that could cause a problem.
So any flowers along the edge of the corn fields.
That's correct. And it can move, if you think about road ditches and the way the surface water moves, it can actually move quite a ways. There's some great studies from other parts of the country showing how it can move and get taken up by other plants that are not even in the target field. And of course, most farmers don't rotate crops anymore. You know, back when I was a kid and we were milking cows, you only planted corn in a field for 1 year. Nowadays, you mostly plant corn after corn after corn, and then you use chemicals to keep the weeds down and to keep the insects down. But if you were to rotate crops, anything you plant in that field, as you guys were bringing up, the neonics stay in the soil. And so anything you plant there, whether it's alfalfa or whether it's barley or oats or peas, anything you plant there is going to take up the neonics. And because it's a systemic pesticide, it will be in every cell of that plant. And any pollinators, let's say it's a nectar producing crop, any pollinators that gather nectar from that alfalfa, say, will be exposed to neonics. And yes, we're talking about
what about soybeans? Because we have quite a few farms now growing soybeans.
Yep.
And I believe they use neonic seed. Is that a problem as well as the corn, or a bigger problem, or what's the deal with soybeans?
So soybeans are actually a pretty good source because they're a legume. They're similar to Canada peas or to alfalfa or clover in that they are a very good source of nectar. So in some areas, beekeepers can get a crop of honey off of soybeans. Until recently, they weren't a big crop in Vermont because of the short growing season and the limited utility. But any area where soybeans are grown conventionally, the bees would be collecting nectar and pollen from them and then would be exposed to the systemic neonics that are in the soybeans.
Yeah. But that doesn't seem to be a problem here, or is it a problem?
It absolutely is. It's just there's a lot more acreage of corn than soybeans, by a huge factor. So it's mostly the corn. If you switched every acre of corn to an acre of soybeans, we'd probably actually see a more dramatic die-off because the bees would be collecting both nectar and pollen, so there'd be more exposure rather than less. Corn is wind pollinated, so it does not produce any nectar to lure pollinators in since it's wind pollinated. So the corn is only producing pollen that the bees might end up collecting.
Yeah. Other questions for Andrew?
I'm all set.
A lot of information.
Yeah. You're located in Addison County, Andrew?
That is correct. And I can be reached if you have any questions or follow-up. If you go to the Vermont Beekeepers website, there is a contact link and I can be reached by contacting president@vba.org. Or you can get my my personal email, my business email from Linda as well. So please reach out. I'm more than happy. It's part of my job with the association is to educate the public. We actually just wrote a huge grant to Specialty Crop. And it's about educating the public about bees and the benefits of honeybees and pollinators in general. We don't know if we've gotten the grant yet, but if we do, we'll be doing a 2-year educational campaign to try and raise the profile of honeybees and pollinators in Vermont.
Yeah, well, Charlie was on with us yesterday.
Charlie
And
Mraz?
Yeah,
Yeah, he gave us a lot of information and rightfully very concerned about what's happening to the bees and so we're gonna, we have Kerry Jiguer from the agency. I don't know if he's the one that told you guys that neonics were not a problem at the first meeting of the Ag Innovation Board or not, but he couldn't be with us until a week from this coming Tuesday, so because he's going to be out of state, but we're going to have him in and if you folks need to come back with more information, but that's going to give us some time to look that info over that you're sending us or have sent us, and so we'll be back on this a week from Tuesday.
That sounds
with
great.
People from the agency, and I know one question that I have already, why weren't you guys invited to participate on that board? I mean, it was set up so that you could iron out these issues and come forward with a corrective plan. And if you aren't even at the table, you're on the menu,
I completely agree, and I think it's important that when you're moving forward, you keep asking yourself that question, because I would like to know why we were ignored as well.
Well, don't worry, it'll get asked.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact Linda and she'll get word to us.
Very good. Like I say, feel free to reach out if you need any more information or any follow-up. I'd be more than happy.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you now.
Yeah.